Hi, my name is Tim Rice, and I teach psychology from a Christian perspective to Christian high school students. And if you're watching this tape, it's because your student is enrolled in my class. This tape is intended for parents, and it is intended to answer a question that I would have had my homeschool student been enrolled in a class that was taught from a Christian perspective. I would want to know what this guy means when he says Christian perspective. So that's what this is about. This is a short part of the orientation that I do. This is for parents. I'm not going to go over the classwork or the mechanics of the delivery platform. This is about what I mean by a Christian perspective, what's different about this class, and also what's not different about this class. Because in many respects, this class isn't different. In many respects, this class is like any other introductory psychology class that your student might take. There's my family. I have three homeschool graduates and one almost homeschool graduate. My wife was taking the photograph. In many respects, this class is not different from any other class your student would take. We will cover these topics. Those are the chapters in the textbook, and those will be basically the chapters in any Psych 101 textbook you pick up. So it's not different that we're going to study the brain and the nervous system and sensation and perception and personality and abnormal psychology and treatment psychology. It's interesting that sometimes when Christians talk about psychology, or not just Christians, when anybody talks about psychology, they equate psychology with abnormal and treatment psychology. And we're going to deal with those two issues, but as I tell the students in Lecture 1, psychology is a whole lot more than just abnormal and treatment psychology. But we'll deal with all of those topics at a CLEP test level. I had the CLEP test scope and sequence with me as I wrote the textbook. So that's not different about the class at all. And it's also not different that we will look at these major schools of thought, that we will look at these major perspectives. These are the ways that throughout its modern history, psychology has viewed itself. We'll see that these are worldview perspectives on psychology. And your students are going to get a real good introduction to these major schools of thought, these philosophies. But that's not different. What's different is the Christian worldview. Now, I'm not a Christian worldview expert. And I don't claim that this is the Christian perspective. I say a Christian perspective. And even when I say that, I'm not talking about the Christian worldview writ large. We're really only interested in those parts of a Christian worldview that intersect these subject areas. We're not interested in the breadth of the Christian worldview. We're interested in the Christian worldview vis-a-vis these worldview perspectives. So what that means is that we're less interested in theological minutia or the differences that Christians have with respect to their worldview. We're interested in these parts of the Christian worldview. These are the parts of the Christian worldview that intersect with psychology's content and psychology's worldview perspectives. And when we narrow it down to just these 5 areas, it's real easy for us to contrast the Christian worldview with all of the other naturalistic worldviews that are out there. We won't lose sight, and it'll be easy to contrast the Christian belief in God, an intelligent designer, a personable God who created us in his image. We all believe that. And it's easy for us to contrast that with the worldview, major psychology's perspectives that say that natural processes alone are sufficient to explain mankind. It's an easy contrast for us to make. And we'll spend a lot of time doing that with respect to evolutionary psychology. We'll look deeply at what the implications of evolutionary psychology are and compare that with a creationist perspective. Easy contrast to make. Similarly, a biblical anthropology, a biblical perspective on the nature of man. That's huge. A huge part of the class is to contrast or to point out that clear contrast between a biblical perspective on human nature and the world's perspective. We're all, to some degree, dualists. We believe that, sure, we have a body and we have brains, and so does a horse, but to be human means to be something special. It means to have a supernatural nature. It means that to be human means in some way to reflect God's likeness in us. So we won't lose sight of that, and that's a big part of what we talk about. We also won't lose sight on a biblical epistemology or a Christian understanding about the sources of and the limits of knowledge. And that will cause us to talk about science a whole lot. You may have heard that some people say that Christians are anti-science, that Christians are anti-psychology. Well, that's not true. We may be anti-scientism, we may be anti-empiricism. We are anti a perspective that says that only things that we can touch, taste, and feel, only things that we can experiment on are real. We won't lose sight of the fact that the Bible is not only a valid source of information about everything, including the human mind, but it's infallible, and that we'll see examples of how the Bible is just right on and confirmed as if it needs confirming by modern psychology. So a Christian epistemology is something we won't lose sight of. Moral absolutes. We will look at worldview perspectives that suggest that morality is relative, that it's learned, that it's taught, that it's changing. What's moral today wasn't moral yesterday, and what's moral for you is not moral for me. We won't play that. And finally, a biblical perspective, a Christian perspective on mental pain and suffering. And this one's maybe the most difficult, because this is surely a part of the Christian worldview that intersects with psychology, but it's also a part of a topic about which Christians often disagree. For us, it is easy to contrast the Christian worldview that says sin and disunity with God, it will mess you up. You can contrast that easily with the world's perspective that says sin and disunity with God. What are you talking about? Those are meaningless concepts. It's always a chemical imbalance, a traumatic event, or your environmental circumstances. But sin and disunity with God, So that's easy for us to do. But what we'll also have to deal with is the Christian disagreement, which leads some to say that sin and disunity with God is always the cause of mental pain and suffering, with those who say that there are other causes, that a chemical imbalance in the brain will also cause mental pain and suffering. Christians also disagree about whether it's appropriate to use techniques from modern psychology to bring to bear to treat mental pain and suffering. And the other side in Christendom says no, a biblical approach is only appropriate. Biblical counseling, you may not use any techniques from modern psychology. And it's not my job don't feel it's my place to say, students, this is where I come down on that issue, but instead to explain where Christians disagree so you guys can deal with those questions on your own, but still making the point clear that one's relationship with God, we all agree, is foundational to mental health. And I'll also, in the class, give students some heads up, some warnings. I don't want them to be blindsided when they get to college. I don't want some professor telling them something about psychology that they hear first there. So a lot of warnings and opportunities for them to think about these things, think about what they're going to hear and what they're going to say before they ever get there. Because that's my overarching goal, parents. Less interested in teaching students psychology's content and more interested in making sure that students can bring their Christian worldview to bear on each topic in psychology, and that they can respond to each of psychology's major worldviews, major schools of thought from their Christian worldview perspective. And we do that right off the bat with lecture number 1, making them understand that without the mind of Christ, they're going to be in a world of hurt when they get to college. So now I can take a breath. When I get on tape, I get nervous and talk too fast. So please write me if you have any questions. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon in class. I'll say that again. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for signing your student up for my class, and I will see you soon. You're welcome any week in class, parents, but if you can't come now, you hopefully can feel some comfort that I'm not going to fill their head with some non-Christian worldview bunk. So, bye.